The morning my brother fired me from our family business, he stood in our father's old office, placed a termination letter on the desk, and said, "You should have seen this coming. I had worked there for 17 years. I had signed the largest client in company history, rebuilt our supplier network after a factory closure, and spent 6 months caring for our dying father while my brother traveled the country, calling himself the future of the company. Still, he looked at me as if I were an employee who had overstayed her usefulness. He said the business needed one leader. He said family loyalty could not interfere with progress. Then he gave me 30 minutes to collect my things. What he did not know was that he had never read the ownership documents our father signed 3 years earlier. By the time he finally opened them, I was no longer asking for my job back. I was deciding whether he would keep his. I was 46 when this happened. My brother, Michael, was 49. The business was called Hartwell Packaging and Supply, a regional company based outside St. Louis. We sold food-safe containers, labels, shipping materials, and custom packaging to bakeries, small manufacturers, meal prep companies, and local grocery chains. Our grandfather started the business from a rented warehouse in 1968. Our father, Thomas Hartwell, expanded it from 6 employees to nearly 90. By the time Michael and I joined, Hartwell had 3 warehouses, a printing division, and annual revenue just under $30 million. We were successful, not famous, not enormous, large enough to support several families, small enough that one bad contract could still hurt. Michael joined first. He had a business degree, confidence, and the kind of personality that made customers believe he had already solved problems they had only begun describing. Dad placed him in sales. Michael excelled. He won accounts, entertained clients, and loved being visible. I joined 4 years later after working in procurement for a hospital network. Dad placed me in operations. At first, I was offended. I believed he saw Michael as the leader and me as the person who would handle details. That was partly true. It also turned out I was good at details. I understood inventory turns, vendor contracts, freight pricing, quality complaints, and the 1,000 quiet decisions between a purchase order and a satisfied customer. I made sure the warehouse could fulfill what he promised. For years, we worked well together. We argued constantly. He accused me of being cautious. I accused him of selling tomorrow's capacity today. Dad said our differences made the company stronger. What he did not say was that he relied on me to repair Michael's risk after praising Michael for growth. That imbalance built resentment in both of us. Michael believed I received credit for controlling his ideas. I believed he received applause while I absorbed consequences. Still, we remained family. We spent holidays together. Our children grew up in the warehouses, building forts from flattened cartons and stealing candy from the receptionist's desk. Michael's wife, Dana, handled company events and eventually became unofficial director of family relations. My husband, David, taught middle school science and wanted no role in Hartwell. That protected our marriage from business politics. It also meant I often returned home carrying conflicts he could not see. The trouble began when Dad's health declined. He had congestive heart failure and kidney disease. At 74, he still came to the office 3 mornings a week. He refused to discuss retirement formally. Michael began introducing himself to major clients as the next generation of Hartwell leadership. Dad did not correct him. I asked Dad privately whether there was a succession plan. He said, "You two will work it out." That is not a plan. You always want papers. Papers prevent memory from becoming power. He smiled. You sound like your mother. Our mother, Ellen, had died years earlier. She had managed the books when the company was small and distrusted verbal promises. I considered the comparison a compliment. Dad eventually agreed to meet with an estate attorney, corporate counsel, and accountant. Michael attended the first meeting and left early for a client dinner. I attended every meeting. That mattered later. At the time, I thought we were discussing taxes, voting rights, and continuity. The company had a complicated structure. Hartwell Operations ran the warehouses and employees. Hartwell Properties owned 2 buildings and leased them to the operating company. A separate trust held life insurance and certain shares. Dad owned the controlling interest. Michael and I each held minority shares accumulated through annual gifts. The attorneys recommended restructuring ownership before Dad's health worsened. Michael assumed Dad would transfer voting control to him because he was older, male, and president of sales. No one said that directly. Everyone behaved as if it might happen. Dad behaved differently in private. He asked me detailed questions. Who could run operations if I became ill? Which managers were ready? How much debt could the company safely carry? What would happen if Michael promised discounts without approval? I answered honestly. Sometimes, too, honestly, I told Dad Michael was talented but impulsive. I also admitted I was overly controlling and slow to delegate. Dad said, "At least you know your weakness." I replied, "Knowing is not the same as fixing." 3 years before he died, the restructuring documents were signed. Dad told us ownership would remain balanced. Michael heard equal, I heard uncertain. The final documents went into the corporate records cabinet, our attorney's files, and a bank safe deposit box. Michael never asked to read them. He said legal language gave him headaches. Dad died 18 months later. The last months were difficult. Michael visited often at first, then less as Dad became confused. I managed medications, appointments, and hospice coordination with a nurse. That created another resentment. Michael believed I controlled access. I believed he avoided the hardest days. At Dad's bedside, old competition returned in ugly forms. Michael asked whether Dad wanted him to take care of the company. Dad said, "Take care of your sister." Michael interpreted that as emotional approval. I interpreted it as warning. Neither of us asked what Dad meant. After the funeral, business continued, because customers do not pause for grief. The board appointed Michael interim chief executive. I remained chief operating officer. The title made sense temporarily. Michael had client relationships. I had internal control. Our accountant said the ownership review would occur after probate and tax filings. Michael did not wait. Within weeks, he moved into Dad's office. He replaced the family photographs with framed industry awards. He hired a branding consultant. He announced a plan to expand into national e-commerce fulfillment. The idea required new software, warehouse space, and debt. I asked for a feasibility study. He said, "This is why Dad never let you lead." That sentence shocked me. Dad never said that. He did not have to. Michael began excluding me from strategy meetings. Dana attended some of them despite having no formal role. She said she was helping with culture. I told Michael family members should not receive confidential information without a position. He accused me of jealousy. The company became divided. Sales followed Michael. Operations came to me. Employees learned to wait and see which sibling's instruction would survive. That was dangerous. I tried to force structure. Written approvals, capacity reviews, board minutes. Michael called it bureaucracy. Then he signed a lease for a fourth warehouse without board approval. The building needed major repairs and sat farther from our customer base than the consultant had recommended. I confronted him. "You do not have authority to commit the company alone. I am chief executive, interim." His face changed. He said, "Not for long." A week later, he scheduled the meeting where he fired me. Human Resources Director Karen Walsh sat beside him. Our outside attorney was not present. That should have warned him. The termination letter accused me of insubordination, obstruction, and undermining executive authority. It offered 6 months severance if I resigned all positions, signed a confidentiality agreement, and transferred my company shares at a valuation determined by Michael's chosen appraiser. I read that paragraph twice. You want me to sell my shares? It is cleaner. At what valuation? Fair market. Determined by whom? An independent professional. Chosen by you. He leaned back. This company cannot function with 2 leaders. I said, then stop making commitments outside your authority. Karen looked uncomfortable. Michael pushed the letter toward me. You have 30 minutes. I asked whether the board approved my termination. I control the board. He did not. He believed he did. That was the first sign he had never read the documents. I could have told him immediately. Part of me wanted to. Instead, I said, I will have counsel review this. He smiled. You always hide behind paperwork. No, Michael. I read it. I packed my office. Employees watched. Some cried. I told them not to interfere. Carlos Medina, our warehouse director, said, This is wrong. I answered, Do not risk your job for a decision that has not finished happening. I took personal photographs, notebooks, and my mother's old adding machine. I left company files behind. At home, David found me sitting at the kitchen table. He asked whether I wanted comfort or strategy. That was one reason I loved him. Strategy first. I called corporate attorney Miriam Cho, who had handled the restructuring. She listened quietly, then asked, Did Michael cite the voting agreement? No. The family trust? No. The special Class B shares? No. I closed my eyes. Dad had created two classes of ownership. Class A shares carried economic rights. Class B shares carried enhanced voting rights on executive appointments, sale of major assets, new debt above a threshold, related party transactions, and removal of family officers. I owned 60% of the Class B shares. Michael owned 30. An independent trustee held 10. Economically, Michael and I owned almost equal portions of the company. In governance, Dad had given me control over specific high-risk decisions. Not total control. Not the power to run everything alone. The power to prevent one sibling from acting without checks. Dad had also signed an employment protection agreement requiring any termination of a family executive to receive approval from the independent trustee and outside board member. Michael's letter had no such approval. Legally, my termination was invalid. The warehouse lease also exceeded the debt and commitment threshold requiring Class B consent. I had never consented. Miriam said, "We can seek an injunction Monday." I asked for 24 hours. That surprised her. Why? Because if I go back only to reverse him, the company remains divided. I needed to understand Dad's intention. Miriam sent me the full documents. I read all night. The ownership structure contained another provision I had forgotten. If either sibling attempted to force the other to sell shares below an independently determined value, voting control temporarily shifted to the independent trustee until review. Michael's severance proposal triggered that clause if formally executed. He had not only fired me without authority, he had weakened his own voting position. The midpoint arrived the next morning. Karen from HR called my personal phone. She sounded frightened. Michael had announced my departure as final. He told managers I had chosen retirement. Several employees knew that was false. Then he ordered payroll to prepare a separation agreement for my signature and instructed IT to erase my access permanently. Karen asked whether she should comply. I said, "Follow lawful instructions and preserve all records." She whispered, "Is his instruction lawful? I cannot advise you personally. Call company counsel." Michael had bypassed Miriam and used a local lawyer who handled minor contracts. That lawyer had not seen the ownership documents either. By noon, Miriam sent formal notice to Michael, the board, trustee, and bank. My termination lacked approval. The warehouse lease required review. The forced share clause activated governance protections. An emergency board meeting was scheduled. Michael called me immediately. "What are you doing?" "Reading." "You are trying to take the company." "No, I am stopping you from pretending you already did." He accused me of manipulating Dad while he was ill. That cut deeply. "You were in the first meeting. You stayed for the rest. You left. Because I trusted my family. No, because you assumed the outcome." He hung up. The board meeting took place on Monday. Present were Michael, me, Miriam, the independent trustee, our outside board member, the accountant, and Karen for the employment issue. Michael arrived with Dana. Miriam said Dana could not attend. Michael objected. Dana left angrily. The trustee, Helen Grant, was a retired bank executive and longtime friend of Dad. She opened the meeting by reading the relevant provisions. Michael's face changed as the language became clear. He interrupted. "Dad would never give Emily control over me." "My name is Emily," Helen replied. "He did not. He created shared controls. He made me chief executive, interim chief executive." Michael looked at me. "You knew." "I knew there were protections. I did not know every trigger until I reread them." "You let me fire you. I let you reveal whether you understood your authority." "That was partly true. It was also cruel. I wanted him to feel the humiliation I had felt. I regret that motive." The board voided my termination. It suspended approval of the warehouse lease pending legal review. Michael remained interim chief executive, but any major financial commitment required temporary board approval. I could return immediately. I did not. I said I would remain on paid administrative leave for 2 weeks while an independent governance review occurred. Michael called it theater. Perhaps it was. I needed distance. Employees did not need us fighting in hallways. The review uncovered problems. Michael had signed vendor contracts tied to the new warehouse. He had approved consulting fees to a marketing firm partly owned by Dana's cousin. He had promised a national customer pricing below sustainable margin. None of these actions alone amounted to criminal fraud. Together, they showed weak governance and undisclosed conflicts. The e-commerce expansion could still work, but not on the schedule he announced. I also faced criticism. The review found operations depended too heavily on my personal approval. Managers delayed decisions because they feared I would reverse them. My documentation was strong. My delegation was not. I had built a system that protected the company from Michael and made the company too dependent on me. That was uncomfortable. It was true. The stronger final revelation came from Dad's letter. Helen produced it during the second board meeting. Dad had written separate letters to both of us and instructed Helen to deliver them only if succession conflict threatened the company. Mine began, "Emily, you mistake responsibility for the need to carry everything." Michael's began, "Michael, you mistake confidence for permission." Helen read only the section Dad authorized for joint discussion. He explained the ownership structure. He did not believe either child should control Hartwell alone. Michael understood growth, people, and opportunity. I understood risk, systems, and continuity. Dad wrote, "If one of you defeats the other, the company loses half of what kept it alive." Then came the painful part. Dad admitted he had encouraged competition. He praised Michael publicly because sales success was visible. He relied on me privately because repair work was quieter. He allowed both of us to believe leadership had to be won rather than shared. He apologized. Michael looked down. I began crying. For years, I had wanted proof Dad trusted me more. Michael had wanted the same. The documents were not proof of preference. They were evidence Dad did not trust either of us alone. Michael said, "So what now?" Helen replied, "Now you decide whether your father's structure protects the company or prolongs the fight." That was the real decision. I could use the Class B votes to remove Michael as interim chief executive. The evidence supported it. Several managers wanted me to. Miriam said the board would likely approve. Michael expected me to take his office. Instead, I proposed an external chief executive search. Neither sibling would hold the top title for at least 3 years. Michael would lead sales and market development under defined authority. I would lead operations and governance transformation under defined authority. Major decisions would go through a professional board committee. Dana and all relatives would be barred from paid vendor relationships without full disclosure and independent approval. Michael stared at me. "You are giving the company to a stranger." "No, I am hiring someone who is not trying to defeat a sibling." He said I wanted to humiliate him. I answered, "I wanted that when I read the documents. I do not want it now." That was honest. He rejected the proposal. For 2 weeks we negotiated. He threatened litigation, claiming Dad lacked capacity when signing. Medical records and attorney notes showed otherwise. I threatened removal. Neither threat improved the company. Then, our largest grocery customer placed new orders on hold after hearing rumors of family instability. That forced clarity. We met without attorneys at Dad's old house. The rooms had been empty since his death. Michael stood near the kitchen where our mother once kept company invoices in grocery bags. He said, "I thought being older meant it was mine." I replied, "I thought doing more of the hard work meant it should be mine." "Did you?" "Yes." He nodded. "I hated that Dad called you when things went wrong. I hated that he called you when things went well." For the first time, we named the actual wound. Michael admitted he fired me because he believed I would challenge every expansion until employees saw him as ceremonial. I admitted I had challenged him publicly to demonstrate his weakness. We had each helped create the story the other feared. That did not excuse the termination. It made repair possible. Michael accepted the external search. I returned to work under an interim governance agreement. My office had already been cleared for a consultant. I chose a smaller one near operations, instead of reclaiming the executive suite. That surprised people. It also helped me stop turning location into proof. The company hired Renee Foster as chief executive. She had 20 years of experience in industrial distribution and no family connection. She was calm, direct, and unimpressed by Hartwell history. On her first day, she said, "A family story is not a strategy." Michael disliked her immediately. So did I. That was a good sign. Renee required role descriptions, decision matrices, succession plans, and manager development. She scaled the e-commerce concept down to one pilot region. She renegotiated the warehouse lease rather than canceling it. The building became useful after repairs and a smaller launch. Michael had not been completely wrong. He had been dangerously early, and insufficiently checked. I had not been completely right. My caution would have delayed a real opportunity indefinitely. The pilot succeeded modestly, not dramatically, profitably. Michael learned to present proposals with capacity, margin, and downside analysis. I learned to approve decisions without rewriting them. We still argued. Renee ended meetings when they became personal. Once she said, "I do not care what happened at Christmas in 1997. We both laughed because the argument had somehow reached childhood. The forced share clause expired after independent review. My Class B control remained. So did Michael's economic ownership. We signed a family governance charter requiring annual education, conflict disclosure, and mediation before employment action involving relatives. It felt absurd that siblings needed formal rules to speak. We did. Karen remained HR director. I apologized for placing her between us. Carlos became vice president of distribution. 2 younger managers received authority I had previously kept. That was difficult. One made an inventory decision I disliked. It worked. Another failed. We corrected it without treating failure as proof I should control everything again. Michael's marriage to Dana became strained after the vendor conflict. She believed I had targeted her family. Michael initially defended her. Then, the review showed the marketing firm's fees were nearly 40% above comparable bids. Dana claimed the premium reflected quality. Perhaps partly. The lack of disclosure remained wrong. She stepped away from company events and later built her own event business unrelated to Hartwell. Our relationship stayed distant. Not every family bond heals. Michael and I slowly repaired ours. The first real sign came when a supplier crisis hit 18 months later. A resin shortage threatened several customers. Michael negotiated alternate material access through a relationship he had built for years. I redesigned allocation and production schedules. Neither of us claimed sole credit. At the customer meeting, Michael said, "Emily's team created the recovery plan." I answered, "Michael secured the material that made it possible. Dad would have noticed." That thought made both of us quiet afterward. 3 years after Renee arrived, the board reviewed whether a family member should become chief executive. Neither Michael nor I applied. He remained president of growth and client strategy. I became president of operations and governance. We had influence without needing one title to prove who won. Renee stayed 5 more years. Under her leadership, revenue grew steadily, debt remained manageable, and employee turnover declined. The company survived succession because we stopped treating blood as qualification and paperwork as insult. I am 53 now. Michael is 56. We own Hartwell together economically. The voting structure remains balanced through protections Dad designed and new provisions we added. We no longer call the company mine in arguments. We say ours, and we try to remember ours includes employees, customers, and obligations beyond the family. The termination letter remains in my home office. I kept it, not as a trophy, as evidence of how quickly authority becomes abuse when no one reads the rules. Michael once asked why. I said, "So I remember what you did." He looked hurt. Then I added, "And what I wanted to do back." That was the full truth. When I discovered the ownership documents gave me leverage, I felt powerful. For several days, I imagined removing him, canceling his plans, and making him walk past the employees who watched me leave. If I had done that, the legal result might have favored me. The company would still have lost. Justice is not always the most satisfying use of power available in the moment. Sometimes justice requires consequences, structure, and refusing to become the person who hurt you. Michael faced consequences. His authority was reduced. His contracts were reviewed. His decisions became visible. He apologized publicly to leadership for misrepresenting my departure. He apologized privately to me without saying, if I faced consequences too. My control was examined. My managers were empowered. I had to hear that loyalty did not make dependency healthy. Dad's documents prevented one sibling from taking everything. They could not make us trust each other. We had to build that through repeated choices. The title makes people smile. Brother fires sister. Sister owns the votes. Brother never reads the papers. It sounds like a perfect reversal, but the documents did not secretly make the business mine. They proved the business was never his alone. That distinction mattered. I did not return because I had won. I returned because the company needed both correction and continuity. Michael stayed because removal would have satisfied anger and wasted talent. We hired outside leadership because family history had made objective judgment impossible. Those choices were less dramatic than revenge. They lasted longer. Every year, new managers attend a governance session. We show them the decision matrix, ownership classes, conflict policy, and escalation process. Michael opens the session now. He usually says, "Read the documents before you act." Employees laugh. He laughs too. Then he becomes serious. He tells them, "Authority is not what you assume people meant. It is what has been assigned, reviewed, and accepted with accountability." I follow by saying paperwork cannot replace character. It can create the pause where character has a chance to appear. That pause saved Hartwell. My brother took over the family business and fired me because he believed leadership had passed to him automatically. He never read the ownership documents. When he finally did, he learned Dad had not chosen one child over the other. Dad had built a structure around our weaknesses. Michael needed limits on confidence. I needed limits on control. We both needed someone outside the family to say no. I lost my job for several days. What I nearly lost was my brother, the company, and the chance to become a better leader than the one who had been fired. The documents gave me power. Choosing how to use it gave me something more important, a business that could survive us. A year after Renee retired, Michael and I returned to Dad's old office to decide what should happen to it. For years, no one had used the room permanently. Too much history lived there. The heavy desk, our mother's framed photograph, the cabinet where the ownership documents had waited unread. Michael suggested turning it into a conference room. I wanted an archive. We argued for 20 minutes before realizing we were repeating the same pattern in miniature. He wanted the space active. I wanted the history protected. This time, we did not need an attorney. We divided the room. The desk remained. One wall became an archive of company records, photographs, and early product samples. The rest became a small meeting space for leadership development. New managers now sit beneath the same shelves where our father stored contracts and learn how Hartwell survived its most dangerous succession. Not by pretending the conflict never happened, by documenting it honestly. On the first day the room reopened, Michael placed my old termination letter inside a display folder beside the Class B voting agreement. I stared at him. "You kept a copy?" "Of course." "Why?" "So no one thinks I am telling the story better than it happened." That answer meant more than another apology. He had stopped treating the past as something to manage. He was willing to let the record remain. We also placed Dad's joint letter there, though the personal sections stayed private. Beneath it, a small card reads, "Leadership is not inherited once. It is earned repeatedly. I do not know whether Dad would have chosen those words. They are ours. The office no longer belongs to him, Michael, or me. It belongs to the lesson." Family businesses often speak proudly about legacy. They display founders' photographs and repeat stories about sacrifice. But legacy without governance becomes pressure. And history without honest records becomes whatever the most powerful person claims it was. The ownership documents protected Hartwell because our mother and father insisted important decisions be written down. The company survived because, eventually, we stopped treating those papers as weapons and began treating them as boundaries. Michael still hates long legal documents. Now he reads them. I still want to control every detail. Now I ask who else should decide. Neither of us changed nature. We changed practice. That is less dramatic than a sibling discovering a hidden ownership clause. It is also the reason the company remained standing after the surprise was over.